They say I'm the difficult one. Always have been. My daughter used to joke that I came out of the womb arguing with the doctor. Maybe she was right. I've got a temper, I don't apologize easy, and I say what I mean even when it makes people uncomfortable. That's just who I am. But when my younger brother called me from the hospital at 2 in the morning, I wasn't angry. I was scared. And that scared feeling turned into something else entirely when I walked into that room and saw his face. My brother Lester has always been the gentle one, softer than me in every way. Patient, quiet. The kind of man who feeds stray cats and remembers everyone's birthday. We're 11 months apart, not twins, but people mistook us for twins our whole lives. Same height, same build, same gray coming in at the temples these past few years. He's 64. I'm 65. And when I walked into that hospital room and saw the bruising along his jaw, the cut above his eyebrow, I had to grab the door frame to keep myself standing. Who did this? I said. It wasn't the question. Lester looked away from me toward the window. That told me everything. Lester, it's not what it looks like. It looks like somebody put their hands on you. He didn't answer. The machine next to him beeped slow and steady. He'd had a cardiac event 6 months prior. Nothing catastrophic, the doctor said, but enough to put him on daily medication and a strict regimen, enough to make him dependent on other people in ways he'd never been before. I pulled a chair up next to the bed and sat down and waited. I've learned over 65 years that sometimes waiting is the only thing that works. Eventually, he told me. My brother's son-in-law, the man his daughter Raina had married 4 years ago, had been in that house for 2 of those years. His name was Cobb Fentress. He'd moved in after he lost his job, then another job, then a third. Raina had convinced Lester it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet, just until Cobb found something stable. Cobb never found anything stable. What he found instead was that Lester's house was paid off. Lester's savings account had a healthy balance, and Lester, since his heart episode, was vulnerable in ways he hadn't been before. It started small, the way these things always do. Cobb took over managing the household bills because Lester got confused with the online banking. Then, Cobb started driving Lester to his doctor appointments because Lester had handed over his car keys voluntarily after a minor fender bender. Then Cobb started picking up the prescriptions because the pharmacy was on his way home from wherever he went during the day. And somewhere in that slow accumulation of control, Lester stopped being the man who owned the house and started being a guest in it. The medication was the part that made my blood go cold. Lester's heart medication had to be taken every morning without exception. The cardiologist had been very clear about that, and Cobb, this man, this parasite living under my brother's roof and eating my brother's food, had figured out that the medication was leverage. He tells me he forgot to pick it up, Lester said quietly. Or the pharmacy was out. Or he left it in the car and the car's not here, and then he comes to me about the property, about signing things. What things? Lester's hands moved on the blanket. He's got papers, a transfer of some kind. He says it's just a formality, just so he can manage things more easily, but I've read enough to know what it is. He wants the house? He wants everything. I sat there in that hospital room and I breathed. Just breathed. Because if I didn't breathe, I was going to do something I couldn't take back, right there in a fluorescent-lit room with nurses in the hallway. Where's Raina in all of this? I said. Lester went quiet again. She knows. She loves him, he said finally. She thinks he's going through a hard time. She thinks I'm exaggerating. That was the part that gutted me. Not Cobb. Men like Cobb I've understood my whole life. I've dealt with men like Cobb, I know exactly what they are. But Raina, my niece, who I'd watched come into the world, who'd called me Uncle Ray and sat on my lap and fallen asleep on car trips. Raina standing in that house while her father was being ground down and choosing not to see it. I drove home at 5 in the morning. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off for a long time. Then I started making a plan. I have a background I don't talk about much. 22 years with the county sheriff's department. The last 8 as an investigator. I've since retired. I live quiet. I garden in the summer and fix things that don't need fixing in the winter. But the instincts don't leave you. The patience doesn't leave you. And the ability to walk into a room and become whatever that room needs you to be, that doesn't leave you either. Lester and I used to fool our mother when we were boys. We were close enough in age and similar enough in appearance that with the right clothes and the right posture, we could swap without anyone catching on for hours. We hadn't done it in decades. We weren't boys anymore, but we weren't that different either. I visited Lester 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. We talked. We made arrangements. His cardiologist agreed to a brief, supervised pause and 1 medication under close monitoring. Nothing dangerous, carefully managed, documented. I'm not a reckless man. I spent 6 years of my career working elder abuse cases. I know what cutting corners looks like, and I wasn't cutting any. What I was doing was going in. Lester called Cobb from the hospital and told him he'd be home the following Tuesday. He sounded like himself on the phone, tired, a little confused, the way Cobb expected him to sound. I listened from the other side of the room. When Cobb pulled up to the house that Tuesday afternoon, it was me who opened the front door. I had Lester's cardigan. I had his reading glasses, the ones with the tape on the left hinge. I had the shuffle in my step that he'd developed after the cardiac episode. I'd practiced it for a week. I had his mannerisms, the way he paused before answering, the way he touched his collarbone when he was nervous. I had his house. Cobb walked in talking before he even looked at me properly. He had a bag from a fast food place, the smell of it filling the entryway, and he set it on the hall table without asking and said, "Talk to the hospital. They said you're supposed to take it easy. I got you something light." Then he glanced at me, and I saw the flicker, just a fraction of a second, where something passed across his face. Uncertainty. A recalibration. Then it was gone. He decided what he was seeing matched what he expected to see. I understood then how it had happened. Cobb didn't actually look at my brother. He saw an old man who did what he was told, and that was all the looking he needed to do. "Thank you," I said in Lester's register, a little slower than my own voice. "I'm not very hungry." "You should eat," Cobb said, already moving toward the living room, already comfortable, already home. "Doctor says you need to keep your strength up." I ate some of the food. I moved slowly through the house. I went to bed early. I was learning the rhythms of the place. The way the floorboards creaked outside the door, Cobb kept closed, the way he was on the phone late at night in the kitchen, the way he watched me with a particular kind of attention when he thought I wasn't looking. Not concern. Assessment. He was measuring how close I was to signing. The medication came up on the 3rd morning. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when Cobb came in, dressed to go out, keys already in his hand. "I need to pick up your prescription today," he said, not looking at me, "but I'm going to need you to do something for me first." "What's that?" I said. He put a folder on the table. The same papers Lester had described. Property transfer documents, drafted by someone who clearly expected them not to be read carefully. "Just some paperwork, so I can take care of things properly," Cobb said. "You know how it gets complicated when I'm trying to manage things and everything's still in your name." I looked at the papers. I looked at them for a long time. "Let me read through these," I said. Sure, take your time. I'll swing back after I pick up the prescription." He picked his keys back up. "Shouldn't take more than an hour." He left. The front door closed. I sat in my brother's kitchen in the quiet. I wasn't angry, which surprised me. What I felt instead was something colder and more useful. I'd felt it before, in the job, in moments when everything became very clear and very still. It's the feeling that comes just before things move. I made a phone call to a colleague, a woman I'd worked with for years who now ran a private investigations firm. I told her what I needed. She said she could have someone positioned outside the property by afternoon. Then I went through the rest of the house. The papers Cobb had left weren't the only papers in the house. I found more in the spare room, a room Cobb had apparently converted to his own office at some point. which I found remarkable given that it was not his house. Bank statements with Lester's name on them, some showing transfers I doubted Lester had authorized. Correspondence with a real estate attorney, a handwritten list of the property's estimated value with notes about comparable sales in the neighborhood. I photographed everything, methodically, calmly. Cobb came back with the medication around noon. He put it on the counter. He didn't bring it to me. He didn't open it. He set it down where I could see it, and then he sat at the kitchen table and said, "Get a chance to look at those papers?" "I have some questions," I said, a small tightening around his eyes. "Like what?" "Sit down," I said. "I'll make coffee." We sat across from each other at my brother's kitchen table. I asked careful questions, vague ones, the kind that let him talk, the kind that made him feel like he was explaining things to someone who barely understood them. Men like Cobb love that. They expand into it. He told me how the transfer would simplify things, how it wasn't really a change of ownership, just a management arrangement, how Raina was so worried about me, how it was really the best thing for everyone. I nodded. I asked another gentle question. He talked more. I was recording every word of it on the device in my shirt pocket. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that my colleague outside had captured him entering and leaving with the medication. What he didn't know was that I'd already spoken to Lester's cardiologist by phone that morning and obtained a formal letter documenting the pattern of medication delays Lester had reported over the preceding months. What he didn't know was that the county's Adult Protective Services unit had an open intake form with his name on it, started 2 days prior. He was building a case for himself. I had already built one against him. On the 5th day, Raina came by. I'd been dreading this, if I'm honest. I didn't have a clear picture of Raina, whether she was a victim of Cobb's manipulation or something closer to a participant. I needed to see her. I needed to understand where she actually stood. She came in with groceries, cheerful, talking before she'd cleared the doorway, and when she saw me at the kitchen table, she smiled and said, "Dad, you look good. You look so much better than—" And then she stopped. She looked at me for a moment that stretched. I held her gaze. Something shifted in her face. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But I spent 22 years reading faces, and I caught it clearly. She knew, not completely, not consciously, but somewhere underneath the surface she knew that something in this room was not what it was supposed to be. She put the groceries down slowly. She said, "I'm going to make lunch." I let her. While she moved around the kitchen, I watched her, and she moved with the tightness of someone trying not to look at something directly. She asked about my sleep, about how I was feeling, about whether the medication was helping. She didn't look at the folder on the table. After she left, I sat quietly for a long time. On the 7th morning, Cobb pushed. He came downstairs while I was still in my robe with the papers already in his hand, and there was something different in his manner. Harder, less patient. The courtesy had worn thin. "I need these today," he said. "Raina and I need to move forward with some plans, and we can't do that until this is handled." I looked at him, not the way I'd been looking at him. The mild, confused look, the elderly man not quite keeping up. I looked at him the way I actually look at people. He felt the difference. I saw it. "Something wrong?" he said. "Sit down, Cobb," I said, and my voice was my voice, not Lester's voice, mine. He sat, slowly. "I'm going to tell you something and I need you to listen carefully," I said. "I'm not Lester." The color in his face changed. I told him who I was. I told him what I'd been doing for the past 7 days. I told him about the recordings, the photographs, the documentation from the cardiologist, the Adult Protective Services case, the investigator who had been outside the house every day capturing his comings and goings on a timeline that told a very specific story. I told him about the bank transfers and the property documents I'd found in the spare room he'd made his own without invitation. He didn't say anything for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. "You can't prove," he started. "I can prove everything I just described to you," I said. "I've spent 22 years building cases. I know what proof looks like, and I know what it doesn't look like, and what I have is the first kind. This is illegal, he said. What you did, impersonation. Have a lawyer check that, I said. While you're at it, have them look at the property transfer documents you drafted and the pattern of medication obstruction that a cardiologist has now formally documented. See which of us they're more concerned about. He stood up. He was angry, the red-faced bluster and threat kind of anger that I've seen hundreds of times and that has never once frightened me. You're going to regret this, he said. Probably not, I said. He left the house. I heard his car in the driveway. The engine. The sound fading down the street. I sat at the kitchen table alone in the quiet of my brother's house and drank the rest of my coffee. Then I called Lester. And then I called Raina. Raina came over that evening. I was still there. I wasn't going anywhere until Lester was back in his own house properly. She came in without knocking, which told me Cobb had called her, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me for a long moment. Your Uncle Ray, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She sat down at the table. She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. Or if she did it quietly, in a way that was private. And I gave her that. After a while, she looked up and said, I knew something was wrong. I knew it for months. I told myself it wasn't as bad as it looked. People do that, I said, not as an accusation. As a fact. He told me Dad was getting confused, that he needed help with decisions, that it was better for everyone if Cobb managed things. She looked at the table. I wanted to believe him. That's the part I have to live with. I wanted to believe him because the alternative was that I'd brought someone into my father's life who was hurting him. There's nothing useful to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She looked up at me. Is Dad okay? He's going to be fine, I said. He's already fine. He's been at my place eating my food and watching my television and being very irritating about the remote control. He's going to come home to his house as soon as some arrangements are formalized, and Cobb is not going to be in it. She nodded slowly. I called a lawyer today. Before I came here, a family law attorney. A different one, not the one Cobb was using. She looked at her hands. I should have done this a long time ago. Yes, I said. But you're doing it now. The formal proceedings took several weeks. The Adult Protective Services case moved methodically through the system. The documentation of medication obstruction, which, combined with the recordings of Cobb's explicit linking of the medication to the property transfer, was enough to bring in the county prosecutor. The property transfer documents, unsigned, were part of the record. The bank transfers were reviewed. Cobb hired a lawyer. The lawyer, once he'd reviewed the actual evidence, had a very quiet conversation with Cobb. I don't know what was said in that conversation. What I know is that Cobb was no longer in the house by the following Thursday, and that the legal process from that point moved with the particular momentum that happens when a man's lawyer has advised him that cooperation is the only remaining option that doesn't end in handcuffs. It ended in handcuffs regardless. But that came later, after the financial examination was complete. Lester came home on a Wednesday morning. I drove him. We pulled into the driveway of the house he'd owned for 31 years, and he sat in the passenger seat and looked at it for a moment without getting out of the car. You all right? I said. I let it go too far, he said. You got scared, I said. You had a health scare, and then someone moved into the space that opened up and made himself necessary. That's not stupidity, Lester. That's something that happens to people. He was quiet. I should have called you sooner. You called me when you needed to. We sat there a minute. Then he said, Did you have to drink my bad coffee every morning for a week? It was terrible, I said. I don't know how you've had that machine for 15 years. He laughed. It was the first time I'd heard my brother laugh in what felt like a very long time, and it sounded like him, the real him, the one who'd existed before fear had made him smaller. I helped him carry his things inside. I made sure the medication was on the right shelf in the right place, easy to reach, controlled by no one but him. I fixed the back door latch that had been loose for months. I stayed for dinner. Raina came for dinner too. She and Lester didn't have an easy conversation. Those don't happen in one evening, and I wasn't going to pretend they would. But they sat at the same table and ate the same food, and that was something. That was a beginning. Before I left, Lester walked me out to the car. It was cool, and the neighbor's porch light was on, and the street was quiet the way it gets on weekday evenings when everybody's inside. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," I said. "Don't what?" "Don't make it formal. You'd have done the same." He tilted his head a little in the way that meant he was about to argue with me. I held up a hand. "You'd have done the same," I said again. "Maybe without the recording device, but the same." He smiled at that. I got in the car. I backed out of the driveway and gave him one wave through the window, and the last thing I saw before I turned the corner was my brother standing in front of his house with his hands in his pockets, standing like a man who lives there. That was enough. That was enough. That was everything.